Is there a white genocide happening in South Africa?
Afrikaans speaking is being targeted in a wave of barbaric and horrifying murder.
Yeah, farm murders, that's really taking the whole country by storm. It's something unbelievable.
They want our guns, they want our money, and they want our land.
It's the 22nd of January 2024 as we record, and as of this recording, there is no evidence whatsoever of an orchestrated attempt by black South Africans to kill white South Africans. But there is a campaign trying to convince you that there is a white genocide underway in South Africa, or at the very least that it's coming, or at the very, very least that there is the disproportionate mass killing of white farmers in South Africa today. So let's look into this. Is there any data to suggest that there is an orchestrated attempt to kill white South Africans, particularly white farmers, en masse? And let's look at the campaign that's trying to convince you that this is happening, no matter what the data suggests. This is the issue on the conspiracy around farm murders and white genocide in South Africa. And this is the issue with Dan Corder. South Africa is a movie. Welcome to the watch party. As you probably already know, every single video episode, you can also find a deeper, longer analysis on all the podcast streamers. And we have a dedicated Patreon where once a week for subscribers, we release exclusive expert interview content on deep and big issues facing South Africa. And your subscription helps us pay the bills and keep the lights on. Right. Last thing I'll ask is please just give us a like or subscribe on this video if you haven't already. Really helps us develop the show. Let's get into it. Two very important things as we start. Firstly, a fair trigger warning. You probably don't need a trigger warning by now if you've watched this far into the episode, but we're talking about allegations of genocide and we're talking about murder and violent crime. So just so you know, as we move forward, that's what we're covering. And secondly, and this is incredibly important, I'm going to be talking a lot about the data, the hard numbers and the context of those numbers where people have died, where people have been killed. And every single murder is a tragedy and a travesty, and I wish that it never, ever, ever happened. But we do need to talk about these deaths because they are being used. These murders are being exploited for a wider narrative by people with an explicit agenda to take advantage of these tragedies. So nothing that I'm about to say diminishes each individual tragedy, each individual awful lost life. Anybody arguing that white South Africans, and particularly white South African farmers, are being killed en masse by black South Africans because they are white has to show two things. The first thing that they try to show is that there is evidence that white South Africans, and particularly white South African farmers, are being killed at an exceptionally high rate compared to the national average of murders every single year. And secondly, they have to show evidence that people are trying to get others to kill white South Africans. So let's look at the data. Official South African Police Service records show that from as early as about 2003-2004, there have been between 50 and 100 farm murders per year in South Africa. Just in case you think, oh, but SAPS is incompetent, or maybe you're a conspiracy theorist who thinks that SAPS has an agenda and they're part of the great cover-up of this awful genocide that is ongoing, let me also add the Transvaal Agricultural Union, because their data pretty much aligns with SAPS every single year. In fact, the TAU usually reports lower numbers of farm murders per year than SAPS does. Broadly, we can say that between 50 and 100 farm murders take place every single year, and every single one of those murders, as I said earlier, is a tragedy and a travesty. Important context, more than 20,000 South Africans are murdered every single year in South Africa. Unfortunately, we live in one of the most crime-affected countries on earth. And so you might be thinking, okay, Dan, between 50 and 100 farm murders, that's a tiny percentage. And you're right, it's 0.4% of all murders every single year take place on farms involving farmers. But then organizations like AfriForum and others will very fairly say, okay, but we need to figure out, based on the number of farmers, what percentage of murders happen every single year. Because what they're trying to show us is, in their view, that farmers are disproportionately highly at risk than the national average of being killed every single year, that it's more dangerous to be a farmer than to be many other things in South African life. So here's where AfriForum, the lobby group, amongst others, will try to define how many farmers there are in South Africa and work out a new rate. Because, okay, example, 2017, on average, 34 out of every 100,000 South Africans were murdered that year. And AfriForum cited the number of farm murders that SAPS said there were that year in South Africa. There were around 70. And then AfriForum said that there are around 32,000 commercial farmers in South Africa. And they worked out that 70 murders into 32,000 commercial farmers makes about 156 people per 100,000 dead on average. Way higher than the 34 people per 100,000 deaths that was the national average on the murder statistics in South Africa at the time. But if you actually look at the data, there are a ton of problems with AfriForum's maths. They're trying to silence me! All right, 2 hours of load shedding done. Where were we? Oh yes. So AfriForum's claim has a number of issues in it. Firstly, when they said that there were around 32,000 commercial farmers, they were using data from a census taken in 2007, a full 10 years before the year 2016-17 that they were comparing that number of commercial farmers with the murder rates for that year. And it's more than likely that that data was unreliable and outdated, and there were many more farmers by 2017 following all the agricultural trends that we had. Secondly, the 2007 census that AfriForum used defined commercial farmers and excluded smaller farmers and non-commercial farmers. But the SAPS data on farm murder rates includes all farmers, including smaller and non-commercial. So if AfriForum had compared their definition of commercial farmers like for like between 2007 and 2017, there would be even fewer murders to account for, farm murders on the kind of big commercial farms that AfriForum was comparing them to from the 2007 census. And there's a third big problem, which is that SAPS's definition of a farm murder is not just what we understand as the farmer versus the farm worker. SAPS's number, 32,000 from 2007, describes farmers, farm owners, rather than farm workers, laborers like the employees. So if we were to take the nearly 100,000 people who work on farms, whether as laborers or as owners, whether as employees or employers, nearly 1 million people, and take the around 70 deaths from 2017, then it's only 9 deaths out of every 100,000 farmers on average, way below the national average of 34 out of every 100,000, and nowhere near AfriForum's headline, which was 156 out of 100,000. And even if we set aside that claim from 2017 from AfriForum with the 3 big problems I've described, all of the claims from AfriForum and all the other people and organizations like them have 2 really big problems. The first one is that when SAPS and these agricultural unions put out their numbers of farm murders per year, they are including all employees and employers, laborers and owner managers, which means that the 50 farm murders recorded in 2022, not all of them were farmers. In fact, less than half of them were farmers, more than 20% of them were employees and laborers. And so if AfriForum and others are trying to make an argument that farm owners, farm managers, and by implication the white ones are being attacked, they've got even fewer farm murders to work with than the full totals that SAPS is putting out. And secondly, both SAPS and the agricultural unions are not specific about what race the people who were murdered are. AfriForum and others can't assume that all of the farm owners murdered are white. And SAPS and the agricultural unions also don't make explicit, and maybe don't even know, the race of the murderers, of the perpetrators, many of whom don't get caught. So the people making these arguments for you can't even claim that all of the murderers are black, are of color. And so all of this data being peddled together from all of these different people and organizations actually provides no grounds, no evidence to suggest that there is targeted, orchestrated, race-defined, race-motivated crimes by Black South Africans against white South Africans. In fact, there is a much more reasonable, although also tragic explanation, which is true not just of farming, but of all industries in South Africa and all parts of South African life, which is that South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world, and many millions of South Africans live in extreme poverty, and very, very often poverty-stricken people are forced into desperate measures like robberies, like targeting the wealthy in their homes or in their businesses. And again, this is true for all businesses and industries and suburbs and towns. And broadly, the wealthy are white, and broadly, the poverty-stricken and forced into desperate acts are black. And unfortunately, farms in rural areas are often the only places of significant wealth in whole districts, while most of the poverty-stricken people living around there live there and rely on working at the farms. So farms are a very obvious and easy target for robberies. But not because the owner is white and the robbers, potential robbers, are black. Not at all. And it's also incredibly difficult, famously all over the world, very difficult to defend a farm. It's an enormous tract of land with huge acreage. And so it's hard to defend farms, and farms are often also isolated, so far away from the range of a South African police force patrol or station to protect. That's why there is an entire industry of private security companies that specialize in providing protection to farms specifically. It's an awful scenario, but it is the reality. And that just is the most likely explanation for why crimes are committed on farms against farms. So then someone trying to convince you that there's a white genocide here or coming and that there's an orchestrated attempt to kill all these white farmers will say, but there is evidence that black people, or at least some of them, are getting together to try to kill white people. Look at Julius Malema, look at the song that he really loves that was originally a struggle song, Kill the Boer, which he and the EFF use very often. Here's the thing though, as of this taping, again, 22nd Jan 2024, there is literally no evidence to show that that song has caused racist intent to kill white people from black South Africans. There's not a single piece of evidence whatsoever. And to be clear, I'm not advocating for or against the Kill the Boer song. I'm just evaluating the arguments put forward by people who want you to believe that there is a white genocide going on because the Kill the Boer song. For them to argue that, they have to provide evidence of a cause and an effect. And there is just no evidence to suggest that the song has caused an increase in farm murders in South Africa. And then generally, when you ask someone who's insisting that there is genocidal intent from a group of black people towards white people in South Africa to show you more evidence of that, that's when the conversation ends. Actually, no, it doesn't necessarily end. What they then tried to do, instead of providing any other kind of evidence, is to insist that there's an evil cover-up and the media is ignoring it and silencing white victims, and it's the ANC that has bought off the media and the country is controlled against white people, and it's just a big conspiracy cover-up. Now, firstly, if somebody argues that, then you've still got to go, okay, but prove that to me. Show me what information you have to suggest that there is a broader cover-up that is not reporting that information. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, and this is just true, that white people's issues are front page news headlines in South Africa. Always have been and always will be. It sells. It does really well, even since apartheid, with the swart gevaar and everything. And the fact that in general, white people have more money and are of a higher class because they have greater wealth. And so they have more of an influence over what gets put in the news because media organizations are appealing to them as potential media buyers, readers, newspaper purchasers, subscribers to various media organizations online. And also, frankly, the vast majority of media companies are owned by white South Africans still. It's not as though suddenly black South Africans own all of the media, far from it. I mean, like Naspers, it's in the name. So if there was wide-scale mass killing of white South Africans, we would know about it. If there was a plot, we would know about it because it is in the direct incentive of media companies to publish and run those stories. It's directly in line with their goals for breaking the biggest stories that make them the biggest profit. So then the conspiracy theorist says, oh, but like, you know, the ANC runs the country. The ANC is unbelievably powerful, but South Africa has got some of the most extraordinary free press, as in freedom of the media to speak, and just free speech in the world. Think about how many media houses absolutely eviscerate, destroy, criticize the ANC and all of its government dealings every single day, all the time. They would not be able to do that if the ANC had control over the media. So there's actually just no credible grounds to believe in a cover-up at all. Like, not at all. But this white genocide farm murders conspiracy theory keeps on ticking over, in spite of no evidence whatsoever to suggest that it's happening. So let's look at the campaign to keep it alive and keep spreading it, because that's been pretty extraordinary. And it goes back a long way, like longer than 10 years. And it was around 10 years ago that Steve Hofmeyr, Afrikaans singer, was shouting particularly loudly about a race war and all white people being in trouble and black people being out to get them. That was around about the time that people were peddling the one white farmer is killed every 5 days in South Africa, which was like thoroughly debunked and shown to be absolutely not true. But then people like Ernst Roots from AfriForum started going on tour. They started trying to convince people in other countries who did not know a lot about South Africa and had no like countervailing basis in facts to resist these claims, trying to convince them that white South Africans were in serious trouble, trying to convince other countries to grant white South Africans refugee status from fleeing the terror in South Africa. And they worked really, really hard. In particular, they tried to get into the US alt-right and far-right network that was mainly carried by Fox News and Tucker Carlson. And they started making some headway. The influential Ann Coulter tweeted in 2017 that the only real refugees are white South African farmers facing genocide. And also in March that year, an Australian cabinet minister offered support for South African white farmers. And then in May, AfriForum pulled off the big one. They went to America May 2018 and got an interview with Tucker Carlson. In August 2018, Tucker Carlson did a show segment on Fox about South Africa, and it seems like then President of the United States, Donald Trump, watched that show because Donald Trump instructed his then Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, to closely study the South African land and farm seizure and large-scale killing of farmers. And since then, Ernst Roots and AfriForum and others have continued to push this agenda, and they've got some pretty enormous Donald Trump level names, most infamously now Elon Musk peddling the same conspiracy theory without any good factual evidence to back it up. But he's like the wealthiest man on the planet right now, and so what he is doing has meaningful consequences. And aside from the very famous names peddling this nonsense, there is also a well fleshed out network of people using the internet and social media to spread the campaign further. And there's just been a horrible example of that, which shows exactly how this works and what the problem is. You may know of the story from late 2023, the tragic murder of a South African woman, Nadine Blanche, and her son, Joandre. And after she was murdered, her then boyfriend, Freddie Stapleberg, came out. I think he wept in public, but he certainly made very loud that he was accusing their gardener, a black man called Pardon, of killing Nadine and Joandre with an axe. The gardener was detained on suspicion of killing Nadine and her son, and immediately a raft of Twitter accounts, including one called End Wokeness, which is an anonymous Twitter account but has millions of followers, tweeted different versions of the same thing. They tweeted the facts of this awful thing, that Nadine and Joandre had been killed. They tweeted that killed by a gardener, implying the gardener being black, and we know that Nadine and the son were white, and then finished the tweet with, in quotes, "Kill the Boer is just a song," implying loudly that this was part of the white genocide taking on in South Africa. And these tweets, particularly the End Wokeness one, went around the world, were viewed millions of times, were reposted hundreds of thousands of millions of times, were read and consumed by so many people as fact. And then, just a few weeks ago, Nadine's boyfriend, Freddie Stapleberg, was arrested on suspicion of killing Nadine and her son. The investigators have good reason, credible grounds to believe that Freddie, the white boyfriend, was involved in the murder. But the damage has already been done because the news of the boyfriend's arrest will not travel nearly as far or reach nearly as many eyes as those original allegations have done. There are millions of people around the world who will never find out the developments in that case because there is no international network, no orchestrated campaign of people spreading and peddling this update in the way that there was to spread and peddle the initial story. And make no mistake, this network exploited and took advantage of this tragedy of Nadine and her son's brutal murder. They saw a window of opportunity to exploit what happened to her and her son and maximize it for their own interests in a disgusting, cruel, and evil way. And they've got what they wanted. And this is how conspiracy theorists work. They take advantage of stories in the exact moment where there's not enough information to infer and imply a very big thing, and then try and spread that as far as they possibly can before the facts and the truth come in later. And that is what this online campaign is trying to do, trying to make a sense that there's a common belief and understanding that there's a white genocide and that there's disproportionately high number of targeted farm murders, particularly of white farmers in South Africa. And if that wasn't enough, these online anonymous campaigners also resort to evil cruelty and intimidation against people who speak out against them. Maybe most famously in South Africa, there's a Facebook group which is called Busting the Myth of White Genocide SA, and they post lots and lots of comments and posts framing and debunking misinformation and lies around the white genocide in South Africa. And the administrators of that account have had to become anonymous because they've been mercilessly targeted. They've been sent death threats. They're trying to shut down people calling out the nonsense, particularly white people, particularly white South Africans. Because when people argue a white supremacist agenda, they know that if they're trying to convince white people that black people are out to get them, they're not worried about black people disagreeing with them. They're worried about white people disagreeing with them. And that's the real threat to a conspiracy theorist for their success at convincing people is, in this case, if you're trying to convince a group of white people, is white people saying, no, that's not true. You're wrong. Thank you for watching. I know that was a lot, I know that was long, but it just has to be laid out. So now we've seen it, that again, 22nd Jan 2024, after more than 10 years of people trying to convince South Africa and the world that there's disproportionate high farm murders, that there's a white genocide coming or has already started, that there is no factual grounded evidence to prove that whatsoever, and there's no likelihood of there being a massive cover-up. And now you can see, laying before you, the way that the campaign to try and convince people works in spite of the evidence. So that's the issue with the conspiracy theory around farm murders and white genocide in South Africa. Thank you for watching. Again, I know it was really long, but it's something that has to be talked about in full so that we all can see clearly what is really going on. Next episode of The Issue is back in about 3 days' time. It comes out on Thursday on YouTube, and also, as you know, all of our public episodes also go on podcasts for deeper analysis. You can find us on any of the streamers that you like. Let me remind you that we also have a Patreon where subscribers get an exclusive expert interview every single week on a big issue facing South Africa. And of course, your subscription goes towards keeping the lights on and developing the show. Thank you so much for watching. And lastly, if you still haven't liked and subscribed on this video on this channel, it would mean the world to us if you did. Have a good few days. See you on Thursday.